Most people believe strength belongs to the loudest person in the room, the one who dominates conversations, controls attention, and always has the final word. But real power rarely announces itself. Sometimes the strongest person is the quiet one sitting in the corner, observing everything while everyone else is distracted by appearances. That person notices things others completely miss: a forced smile hiding resentment, a confident voice hiding insecurity, a sudden silence that reveals tension no one wants to acknowledge. While most people hear words, the empath hears emotions underneath those words, and that ability changes their entire experience of life. The empath does not move through the world the same way ordinary people do. They feel the emotional atmosphere of every environment they enter. A room filled with anger affects them immediately. A hidden conflict becomes obvious before anyone says a single word. They notice changes in tone, body language, eye contact, and energy with almost unnatural precision. People often feel understood around them without even knowing why. Strangers open up to them. Friends trust them with secrets. Broken people feel safe in their presence because the empath has an ability many people spend their entire lives searching for: the ability to truly listen. But this gift comes with a heavy price, because the empath does not only understand emotions, they absorb them. They carry stress that does not belong to them. They replay conversations in their mind for hours, trying to understand every detail, every reaction, every hidden meaning. They feel responsible for helping people heal, even when those people are destroying themselves. Earlier in life, the empath believes love and understanding can solve almost anything. They believe patience can heal pain. They believe compassion can change behavior. And because of that belief, they often give too much of themselves to people who were never capable of appreciating it. The empath becomes the person who forgives repeatedly, the person who gives endless second chances, the person who stays when everyone else walks away. When someone hurts them, they search for the pain behind the behavior instead of protecting themselves from it. When someone lies, they try to understand the fear that caused the dishonesty. When someone manipulates them, they convince themselves the person is simply emotionally wounded. And slowly, without realizing it, the empath begins sacrificing their own emotional well-being in order to carry the emotional burdens of others. At first, this feels noble, compassionate, meaningful, but over time, painful patterns begin to appear. The empath starts noticing that understanding someone does not automatically change them. Understanding manipulation does not stop manipulation. Understanding disrespect does not create respect. Some people appreciate kindness, but others take advantage of it. Some people see empathy as warmth, while others see it as weakness. And this realization becomes one of the hardest lessons the empath will ever face. Because for the first time, they begin questioning everything they once believed about human nature. They start noticing repeated emotional cycles, the same excuses, the same broken promises, the same emotional games repeating with different people wearing different faces. And suddenly, the empath begins evolving. They stop focusing only on words and start paying attention to actions. They begin understanding that emotional intelligence is not simply about feeling deeply, it is about seeing clearly. That is the moment the empath changes forever. Not into someone cold, not into someone cruel, but into someone aware. Someone who finally understands that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Someone who realizes protecting their peace is not selfish, it is necessary. And once the empath learns that lesson, they become something many people never expected: quiet, calm, observant, and incredibly difficult to deceive. There comes a moment in the life of every empath when emotional exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore. Not the kind of exhaustion sleep can fix, a deeper exhaustion, the kind that comes from constantly carrying emotions that were never theirs to hold, the kind that comes from defending themselves in conversations designed to confuse them, the kind that comes from giving endless understanding to people who never intended to understand them in return. And eventually, after years of emotional battles, something inside the empath begins to change. They become quieter. Earlier in life, the empath reacted to everything. Every accusation felt personal. Every misunderstanding demanded clarification. Every emotional attack created anxiety inside them because they genuinely believed honesty and communication could solve almost any conflict. If someone became angry, the empath tried to calm them. If someone pulled away emotionally, the empath chased understanding. If someone blamed them unfairly, they desperately explained their intentions, hoping truth would restore peace. But over time, experience teaches the empath something most people never fully understand. Not everyone wants peace. Some people want control. Many manipulative personalities survive through emotional reactions. They provoke guilt to influence behavior. They create confusion to weaken confidence. They twist conversations to keep others emotionally distracted. Every reaction becomes information. Every emotional response becomes leverage. If someone becomes defensive, the manipulator learns where insecurity exists. If someone feels guilty easily, the manipulator learns how to pressure them. If someone constantly explains themselves, the manipulator learns they can keep shifting the conversation forever. And one day, the empath finally sees the pattern. That realization changes everything. Because the empath begins understanding that reacting emotionally is exactly what keeps unhealthy cycles alive. The more energy they give to manipulation, the stronger manipulation becomes. The more they defend themselves against false accusations, the more trapped they become inside endless emotional games. So slowly, they stop reacting the way they used to. Instead of arguing immediately, they pause. Instead of trying to prove themselves, they observe. Instead of becoming consumed by emotional chaos, they begin studying behavior itself. This new version of the empath feels unfamiliar to everyone around them. Friends notice they speak less during conflict. Family members notice they no longer chase approval the way they once did. Manipulative people become uncomfortable because the emotional reactions they depended on are suddenly gone. And that silence creates power. Because silence forces people to reveal themselves more clearly. Without emotional distraction, behavior becomes easier to see. The empath starts recognizing hidden intentions behind certain conversations. They begin noticing who only contacts them when they need emotional support. They notice who becomes angry the moment boundaries appear. They notice who creates drama simply to regain emotional control. Earlier in life, the empath believed calmness meant weakness. Now they understand calmness is often the highest form of emotional discipline. The mature empath no longer feels responsible for participating in every emotional battle. They realize some conversations exist only to drain energy, not create understanding. Some people do not want solutions. They want reactions. And once the empath understands this dynamic, their behavior changes permanently. They begin protecting their energy carefully, not because they stopped caring, because they finally started caring about themselves too. And this transformation makes them incredibly difficult to manipulate. The guilt no longer works the same way. The pressure no longer creates panic. The confusion no longer controls their emotions. For the first time in their life, the empath understands something powerful. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is awareness. Sometimes silence is emotional intelligence. And sometimes silence means the empath already understands everything they need to understand. That is when true emotional strength begins to appear. Not loud, not dramatic, not aggressive, just calm, controlled, and impossible to emotionally control anymore. Most people only pay attention to what is happening in front of them. They focus on isolated moments, a kind gesture, a beautiful apology, a temporary change in behavior. And because of that, they often become trapped inside emotional illusions. They judge people based on words spoken during emotional moments rather than patterns repeated over time. But the empath eventually learns something that changes the way they see human behavior forever. Patterns never lie. At first, the empath wants to believe the best about everyone. They want to believe mistakes are temporary. They want to believe effort always means growth. So when someone hurts them, they focus on the apology instead of the repeated behavior. When someone breaks trust, they focus on the explanation instead of the inconsistency. Their heart naturally searches for potential instead of reality. But experience slowly teaches the empath a painful truth. Character is not revealed through isolated moments. Character is revealed through repeated patterns. And once the empath understands this, their awareness begins expanding rapidly. They start noticing how certain people only suddenly become kind after causing damage. They notice how some individuals repeatedly promise change during moments of consequence but return to the same behaviors once comfort returns. They notice emotional cycles repeating with almost mathematical precision. The same excuses, the same emotional manipulation, the same patterns hidden beneath different situations. And suddenly, the empath stops being surprised because they begin connecting everything together. A mature empath watches consistency more than charm. They pay attention to actions more than emotional speeches. They notice how people behave when there is nothing to gain. They study how someone treats people beneath them socially, emotionally, or financially. They observe reactions during pressure, conflict, jealousy, and disappointment, because those moments reveal truth more clearly than carefully prepared words ever could. This is where the empath becomes psychologically dangerous to manipulative people. Because manipulators survive through emotional confusion, they depend on keeping people focused on isolated moments instead of long-term behavior. A dramatic apology can erase months of disrespect in the eyes of someone emotionally attached. A few days of kindness can temporarily hide years of inconsistency, but the empath who has evolved begins remembering everything. Not out of bitterness, out of awareness. They remember contradictions between words and actions. They remember promises that never became reality. They remember how someone behaved once comfort returned and accountability disappeared. And slowly, the empath develops a form of emotional intelligence that feels almost predictive. They start sensing outcomes before they happen. That is why emotionally mature empaths often remain calm during situations that overwhelm everyone else. While others are shocked by betrayal, the empath already noticed the warning signs months earlier. While others become confused by manipulation, the empath already recognized the emotional pattern unfolding underneath the surface, and this changes the empath deeply. Earlier in life, they ignored red flags because they believed love required endless patience. They confused emotional attachment with emotional compatibility. They stayed loyal to people who repeatedly revealed destructive patterns because they kept hoping for transformation. But now, something inside them becomes clearer. Potential no longer impresses them. Consistency does. Words no longer control them. Behavior does. And once the empath reaches this level of awareness, relationships begin changing dramatically. They stop investing deeply in temporary emotions unsupported by stable actions. They stop chasing explanations from people whose patterns already revealed the truth. They stop forcing connections that survive only through denial, because the empath finally understands something powerful. The truth about people is rarely hidden in what they say once. It is hidden in what they repeatedly do. And once someone learns to recognize patterns instead of performances, emotional manipulation loses most of its power. One of the most painful lessons an empath will ever learn is that caring deeply about someone does not guarantee they will care deeply in return. In the beginning, the empath believes love can heal almost anything. They believe patience can repair broken people. They believe understanding can transform unhealthy behavior into emotional maturity. And because of that belief, they often become emotionally attached to people who slowly drain the life out of them. The empath becomes the fixer, the listener, the healer, the emotional support system for everyone around them. When someone is struggling, the empath rushes to help. When someone is broken, the empath tries to carry their pain. When someone hurts them, the empath searches for reasons instead of protecting themselves. They convince themselves that if they love harder, stay longer, or understand deeper, things will eventually improve. But reality teaches a far more difficult truth. You cannot heal people who are comfortable destroying themselves. And even worse, some people never wanted healing in the first place. They wanted access. Access to emotional support without responsibility. Access to loyalty without respect. Access to the empath's energy without ever giving the same care in return. At first, the empath struggles to accept this reality because detachment feels unnatural to someone whose entire identity was built around emotional connection. Walking away feels cruel. Saying no creates guilt. Choosing peace over loyalty feels selfish. So they continue sacrificing themselves, hoping things will eventually change. But eventually, exhaustion arrives. The empath realizes they are constantly saving people while nobody is saving them. They are constantly understanding others while nobody is trying to understand them. They are carrying relationships entirely on their shoulders while the other person contributes only inconsistency, confusion, and emotional chaos. And slowly, something inside them begins shifting. Not hatred, not bitterness, awareness. The empath starts understanding that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. They begin noticing how some people only appreciate them once access to them disappears. They notice how manipulative individuals become angry the moment boundaries appear. They notice how certain relationships survive only because the empath keeps abandoning their own emotional needs to maintain them. That realization changes everything, because for the first time, the empath begins protecting their peace instead of constantly protecting other people from consequences. They stop chasing emotionally unavailable people. They stop begging for clarity from people committed to confusion. They stop forcing relationships that repeatedly require them to sacrifice their self-respect. And this is where true emotional detachment begins. Not coldness, not cruelty, balance. The mature empath learns how to care without drowning in other people's problems. They learn how to support others without becoming emotionally consumed by them. They understand that love should not require constant emotional suffering to survive. This new version of the empath feels different, calmer, more grounded, more emotionally disciplined. Earlier in life, abandonment terrified them because they tied their worth to connection. But now they understand something powerful. Not every connection deserves to be maintained. Some relationships exist only to teach lessons. Some people enter your life only to reveal what happens when empathy exists without boundaries. And once the empath fully understands this, they stop fearing distance, because distance often reveals truth faster than attachment ever could. The empath no longer reacts desperately when someone withdraws affection. They no longer panic when unhealthy people walk away. In fact, they begin realizing that losing toxic connections often creates peace instead of pain. And that is when the empath becomes truly powerful, because manipulation depends on emotional dependency. It depends on fear, guilt, and attachment. But once an empath learns emotional detachment, those weapons begin losing their power completely. You cannot emotionally control someone who has finally learned how to let go. There comes a stage in every empath's journey where they become emotionally exhausted from trying to explain themselves to people who were never interested in understanding them. Earlier in life, the empath believed communication could solve almost anything. If someone misunderstood them, they explained more clearly. If someone questioned their intentions, they defended their heart. If someone accused them unfairly, they patiently tried to prove their honesty, because deep down, the empath believed truth would eventually be enough. But life slowly teaches them something painful. Healthy people usually understand after one honest conversation. Manipulative people understand immediately. They simply benefit from pretending they do not. That realization changes the empath forever, because the empath begins noticing a disturbing pattern. Certain people intentionally twist words. They ignore explanations. They create confusion during simple conversations. Every time the empath tries to clarify themselves, the conversation somehow becomes more exhausting, more emotional, and more chaotic. At first, the empath blames themselves. Maybe I explained badly. Maybe I should have stayed calmer. Maybe I should try harder to make them understand. So they continue giving more energy, more patience, more emotional labor. They explain their feelings repeatedly. They defend boundaries over and over again. They try to prove they are loyal, honest, loving, and sincere. But eventually, the empath notices something shocking. The problem was never communication. The problem was intention. Because some people are not searching for understanding. They are searching for control. Confusion becomes a strategy. Misunderstanding becomes emotional leverage. The more the empath explains themselves, the more the manipulator gains opportunities to twist words, shift blame, and drain emotional energy. And one day, the empath finally becomes tired. Not angry, not hateful, just emotionally finished. That is the moment silence enters their life in a completely different way. Earlier, silence came from pain. Now silence comes from clarity. The empath no longer feels responsible for correcting every false assumption. They no longer panic when someone misunderstands them intentionally. They no longer chase people who repeatedly force them into emotional courtrooms where they must constantly defend their character. Because they finally understand something powerful. People who genuinely care about you usually seek clarity. People who want control usually seek confusion, and once the empath understands this difference, their entire energy changes. They stop over-explaining, they stop defending every boundary, they stop trying to convince emotionally unavailable people to become emotionally mature. Instead, they begin observing behavior, because actions always reveal what words try to hide. The empath notices who respects boundaries without argument. They notice who only listens when they are emotionally benefiting. They notice who disappears the moment accountability enters the conversation, and slowly they stop chasing emotional reciprocity from people incapable of giving it. This creates a level of peace the empath has never experienced before. For the first time, they stop leaking emotional energy into endless explanations. They stop replaying conversations in their head all night. They stop carrying responsibility for how others choose to interpret them. And that emotional freedom changes everything. The empath becomes calmer, more focused, more emotionally disciplined. People around them begin noticing the difference immediately. Manipulative individuals become frustrated because emotional access is disappearing. Earlier in life, guilt controlled the empath, confusion controlled the empath, fear of losing people controlled the empath, but now awareness controls them, and awareness creates emotional stability. This is the stage where many people mistakenly believe the empath has become cold, but the truth is completely different. The empath has not lost compassion. They have simply stopped sacrificing themselves for people committed to misunderstanding them. They finally understand that constantly explaining your worth to the wrong people is one of the fastest ways to lose yourself. And once the empath learns that lesson, their silence becomes incredibly powerful, because their silence no longer comes from weakness. It comes from complete understanding. The final stage of the empath's transformation does not look the way most people expect. It is not revenge. It is not anger. It is not becoming cold or emotionally numb. The most evolved empath does not spend their life trying to hurt the people who hurt them. Instead, they become something far more powerful, peaceful, and that kind of peace terrifies manipulative people more than emotional reactions ever could. Earlier in life, the empath believed their purpose was to save everyone around them. They believed loyalty meant enduring pain. They believed love required endless sacrifice. So they stayed in situations that slowly destroyed their mental and emotional stability. They tolerated disrespect because they understood pain behind the behavior. They accepted emotional inconsistency because they hoped patience would eventually create change, but experience changes them. After years of emotional battles, betrayals, disappointments, and manipulation, the empath finally understands something most people never learn. You cannot build peace with people who thrive on chaos. And once that realization fully enters their mind, everything changes. The empath stops fighting unnecessary battles. They stop trying to prove their worth to emotionally unavailable people. They stop chasing closure from individuals who were never capable of honesty in the first place. They stop trying to rescue relationships that only survive through emotional suffering. And quietly, without drama, they begin walking away, not because they hate people, because they finally love themselves enough to protect their peace. This is what makes the mature empath so powerful. Earlier in life, guilt controlled them. Fear of abandonment controlled them. Emotional attachment controlled them. Manipulative people could use silence, distance, blame, or confusion to keep the empath emotionally trapped. But now those weapons no longer work, because the empath has learned emotional self-control. And self-control changes everything. The evolved empath still feels deeply. They still care deeply about people. They still understand emotions better than most individuals ever will. But now their empathy is guided by wisdom instead of emotional desperation. They no longer absorb every emotional storm around them. They no longer drown trying to save people committed to self-destruction. Instead, they observe calmly. They notice manipulation quickly. They recognize emotional patterns immediately. They trust their instincts instead of ignoring them. And perhaps most importantly, they stop abandoning themselves in order to keep other people comfortable. This creates a completely different kind of energy around them. Calm, grounded, unshakable. People can feel the difference without understanding it fully. Manipulative personalities become uncomfortable because the empath is no longer emotionally reactive. Guilt no longer creates panic. Silent treatment no longer creates desperation. Emotional games no longer create confusion. Because the empath finally sees the strategy behind the behavior, that awareness makes them incredibly difficult to control. The mature empath understands human psychology on a level most people never reach. They understand insecurity hidden behind arrogance. They understand manipulation hidden behind charm. They understand emotional dependency hidden behind fake love. Years of observing behavior have sharpened their instincts until they can sense dishonesty long before words expose it. But what truly makes the evolved empath dangerous is not their ability to understand others. It is their ability to understand themselves. They know their emotional triggers. They know their weaknesses. They know the patterns that once trapped them emotionally. And because they understand themselves, they become emotionally disciplined. This is the stage where the empath no longer needs validation from the outside world. Rejection no longer destroys them. Distance no longer terrifies them. They stop measuring their worth based on who stays and who leaves. Instead, they focus on protecting their inner peace. And that is true power, not controlling people, not dominating conversations, not winning emotional battles. True power is remaining calm in situations designed to break you. True power is protecting your energy without becoming cruel. True power is understanding darkness without becoming consumed by it. And few things are more powerful than an empath who has finally mastered that lesson.